Every morning, the team at the Exchange meets to discuss the top stories of the day. Here's a look at what we think makes the cut. Government spent billions of taxpayer dollars to save banks during the recent financial crisis. Now, global regulators have proposed new rules to stop that from happening again. 30 banks around the world identified as systemically important would need to have a bigger financial cushion in place in case of a crisis. Rather than the public rescuing troubled banks, private creditors would be first in line to bear the brunt. Mark Carney, chairman of the Financial Stability Board and governor of the Bank of England, calls the current system that relies on taxpayers unfair. He argues if a bank makes mistakes, it deserves to pay the costs.
Does this protect us from every possible eventuality, including those we can't imagine? No, it doesn't. But does it mean that if an individual major bank makes mistakes, or makes a series of mistakes, and it should fail, it will?
In our meeting this morning, we talked about the new post-recession reality for global banks.
Banks look different than they did in 2008.
This will say, no, it's you debt holders that are on the hook for this.
It
They are
turns
the
into
ones who
something
had all the
else.
upside in the good time. It's about time, I think, they took the risk.
Yeah, it sounds to me like they are so sort of overboard, these rules, that it is kind of hard to believe that they would go belly up.
Garth Brooks has never sold or streamed his music over the internet until now. He's going online and taking the reins. Brooks launched his own iTunes competitor called Ghost Tunes. It pays to have friends in the right places. He's signed on thousands of artists, including big names like Taylor Swift and Trisha Yearwood. About 10 million songs will be available for download. Here's how Ghost Tunes explains what sets it apart from competitors.
Ghost Tunes gives fans the security of owning the music they buy and the convenience of listening to it from any device of their choice instantly. Ghost Tunes also allows artists to sell their music in the way they choose. Full albums, singles only, bundled with goodies, or a 7-song EP, adding variety to the music marketplace.
In our meeting this morning, we chewed over Brooks's chance of success in a market that's already pretty crowded.
I admire him for trying this, but I think it's kind of late in the game to be getting into it.
At what point are these services going to try and get a little more exclusivity?
So I don't know if you need to have a lot of exclusivity for it to work. If it cracks open and pushes iTunes or even Amazon to be more open or to change their terms of service because there's increased competition, then
the artists are
we
fighting
will
back.
benefit from that, whether we buy from Garth Brooks or not.
A photo worth 1,000 words could also be worth a lot of money. Instagram, the photo sharing service, launched ads in Canada, and advertisers hope it will pay off. The ads look like regular Instagram posts, other than the blue sponsored stamp. 6 companies signed up to promote their posts, including Air Canada, Travel Alberta, and Target Canada. They already had Instagram accounts. The sponsored posts reach users who don't already follow them. Instagram is most often used on mobile devices rather than the web. Instead of banner or sidebar ads, Instagram integrates its ads within users' feeds. That's prime real estate for companies targeting Instagram's user base. More than 90% of Instagram users are under 35 years old. The ad strategy was already rolled out in the US, Britain, and Australia. Here's what those test grounds found. Levi's reached 7.4 million people in the U.S. in 9 days. Ben & Jerry's reached 9.8 million people in 8 days. They found that people recalled the ads better and were aware of the brands behind them. Good news for advertisers, perhaps, but we discussed in our meeting whether Instagram risks alienating users by introducing these ads.
A really tricky moment for any app when they start throwing in ads.
They've already tested it out in these other places. If something had gone terribly wrong, then you'd think that they wouldn't bring it here as well.
It strikes me that the barrier to entry to creating the next Instagram is far lower than it is to create the next Facebook, the next Twitter, the next LinkedIn, all these ubiquitous social media platforms that you will put up with this advertising. But to create a photo sharing service that someone could create an ad-free Instagram just for kicks.
I think of all the social media, This is the platform where ads will be the most useful because it's just photos. You're not going to notice them go by.
Do we think that because Facebook owns Instagram that means there's a better chance that Instagram will do this well?
If Facebook can find a way to make it work on Instagram, maybe they can find a way to make it less invasive on Facebook.
For more now on what this means for Instagram and its users, Abid Chaudhry, a senior analyst at BIA Kelsey. So Abid, you heard in our meeting there, some of the people were suggesting that advertising maybe works better on Instagram than it does on some of the other social sites. Do you think that's true?
I think it's definitely true to a point, and I think especially when you think about mobile usage and how it's increasing so fast, that sites and applications like Instagram, where it's basically a single serve, really quick access, get to the advertising, get to the photo as soon as you can type of mechanism, that you find that that actually is more effective than using like perhaps a desktop for an advertising like you would normally with non-mobile devices.
But I mean, from the research you've seen, do these sites often lose users when they do move to adding in the advertising? Are people put off and maybe drop them?
Well, you definitely do see a bump when services like Instagram come out with advertising that is very different from the norm, which was no advertising. And you always see a small segment of users that say that they're just not going to stick around for it. But what Instagram has figured out, and what a lot of social media services are figuring out, is that native advertising element, that ability to show an ad in the stream itself and make it as normal as just looking at another friend's photo, that's made it so that those advertising actually become more effective than if it was just on the side, for example.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious though, just beyond Instagram, you know, when it seems inevitable, you know, the social media comes out as free, then they have to monetize and they start putting ads on it. I mean, how quickly then does a competitor set up and say, you know, okay, we're going to do something very similar to the original social site, but we won't be bombarding you with advertisement? Is that phenomenon becoming entrenched in any way?
Well, it's definitely a phenomenon that's coming up more and often, but what we're finding is that services that have the scale of the sheer number of users that are already using it, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, that because of the sheer numbers of people that are actually using the service, that even if you were to lose a small portion of those users to a non-advertising related service that might spring up, that the primary services like Instagram, for example, would probably not get affected too much because they're just so big now.
What are companies looking at when they're looking at this question and they're trying to sort of balance the customer experience or the user experience, but also, of course, more and more money is going into digital advertising? How are they thinking about that?
Well, I think that the biggest thing that comes to mind is how do we make sure that the experience for the user is as seamless as possible, that whole native element. And so I think more often apps and companies that are looking to create new ways to advertise online or through mobile devices, what they're finding is that they need to really balance the experience not being changed too much by the advertisements being in place. And as long as they can find a happy medium where a user doesn't mind, so to speak, scrolling through and finding a Canadian Tire ad while they're scrolling through their friends on Instagram, and as long as it's a non-intrusive experience, I think that brands and companies are going to have a positive experience in trying to do this more often.
One of the interesting little factoids we had there in the setup to this was that certainly Levi's reached so many people and so forth, the numbers, but the key detail that users were actually remembering more often what it was they had seen. Why do you think that would be? Is there any data to explain why people would have more of a recollection when they're seeing a picture or the way they're consuming it on Instagram?
Well, you know, the closest correlation that you can think about from the old traditional media world would be TV advertising and the whole notion of brand recall. And what we're finding is Instagram is taking a lot of the experiences that we've learned from television brand advertising and using it on their own native advertising formats. And what I would probably bet on is that users are using Instagram services pretty often, and as they're scrolling through their daily feed, they're having greater and greater exposure to these brands that are exposing on through Instagram advertising. And I'd imagine that that's going to relate to a much higher brand recall over time for any brand that takes advantage of that type of service.
Are there any other new and exciting ways that advertisers are trying to access the mobile space that isn't just the, you know, tired old banner ads and that sort of thing?
Well, what's interesting, a couple of things that I've seen that sort of struck me were a lot of brands are taking advantage of novel things like location and the ability for mobile devices to be able to broadcast where a user is in terms of their location, and using that to kind of create an offline-online advertising experience. Recently, I think it was Old Navy did a promotion where they had a vending machine that gave out flip-flops as long as you were in proximity and tweeted about being near that vending machine, and they could verify that by actually having their location. So stuff like that probably is going to start to bubble up, and we're probably going to see that normalize into some new interesting ways in the next few years.
Thanks for being with us.